The imperial diplomatic banquet had been arranged with the specific thoroughness of a civilization that understood the difference between a formal occasion and a significant one, and had decided, long ago, that the two should always coincide. The banquet hall of the Sorvani imperial palace was not a space that had been designed for eating. It had been designed for the performance of eating as a diplomatic act, the specific ritual of sharing a meal as the symbolic expression of a relationship between powers that was more than transactional. The ceiling vaulted above 200 formally dressed figures at the long ceremonial tables, the hall's materials producing the warm luminescence that characterized Sorvani interior architecture. The light, too, even and too, considered to be accidental. Cale Riven had been to 3 formal Sorvani occasions in his 4 years of work as a medical attaché on diplomatic delegations, and he had not stopped finding the quality of them extraordinary. This was his private position. Professionally, he maintained the attentive composure appropriate to his role, which was mid-table and peripheral and correctly understated. He was the delegation's senior health attaché, not its ambassador, and his function at an occasion like this was to be present, to be professional, and to not be the most interesting person in the room, which was an easy standard to meet in a space that contained the Sorvani imperial court at full formal assembly. He ate the courses that were served and spoke with the Sorvani medical liaison, seated 2 positions to his right. A cordial professional conversation about the exchange program's progress. That was exactly the kind of conversation his role at this occasion was supposed to produce. He watched the hall with the peripheral attention of someone whose medical training had given him the habit of environmental awareness without the deliberate quality of someone conducting surveillance. Queen Sarath presided from the hall's head position with the composed authority that he had observed across the summit's formal sessions. The specific quality of someone who did not need to perform authority because it was simply ambient in her, present the way certain physical properties were present in materials that had been made correctly. She was, across the summit's duration, the most naturally compelling figure he had encountered in a professional life that had introduced him to the leadership of several civilizations. The ceremonial cup was brought forward at the banquet's ritual high point. He knew the tradition from the diplomatic preparation materials. The imperial first drink, the queen's cup prepared separately as protocol specified, the symbolic opening of the banquet's formal conclusion. The attendant who carried the cup moved through the hall with the correct ceremonial progression, the cup held in the prescribed manner. Cale was not watching particularly. He was in a sentence of the conversation with the medical liaison, attending to the sentence with the appropriate fraction of his attention. And then something in the peripheral field of his perception registered an anomaly. He could not, afterward, identify the specific component. It was not a smell. The hall's controlled atmosphere did not permit that kind of sensory input at his distance. It was not a sound. It was something in the visual field, something about the cup's surface quality at the angle of the hall's light, something about the specific quality of the liquid's movement when the attendant had adjusted the carry, that his physician's training had processed before his conscious awareness had been consulted. His body was moving before his mind had completed the sentence it was in. The specific sequence of the next 4 seconds was something he would reconstruct later, from other people's accounts, and his own fragmented memory of it. The chair back, the cross of 3 meters of banquet hall at a pace that was not quite running, the queen's expression shifting from the composed ceremonial quality of the ritual high point to something more alert as she registered the figure moving toward her, the cup raised, and his hand on her wrist with the careful pressure of someone who needed the cup not to reach her mouth, and who needed to do this without injury. The cup overturned. The liquid went to the table rather than the queen. The guard response was immediate and exactly correct, 4 members of the royal detail reaching him in the seconds following with the efficient professional movement of people who had trained for precisely this category of event. He was restrained with the controlled force of people who were not punishing but were managing a threat assessment. He said, in standard and in the fraction of Sorvani he had medical. The cup. Test the cup. With the specific compressed clarity of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds were the relevant window for being believed. Advisor Threva was at the Queen's side in the same window. He saw the chief healer's instruments produce the reading. He saw the expression shift. The guard restraint was released. The banquet hall's transformation from formal occasion to emergency medical space took approximately 90 seconds. The time between Threva's confirmation of the toxin and the establishment of the controlled perimeter around the Queen's position. The medical equipment brought from the palace's adjacent preparation rooms. The 200 formally dressed court members reorganizing from the configuration of a shared meal to the configuration of people who have understood that something very different is happening. Kale was through the guard line and at Threva's side within the first minute, not because he had been invited, but because Threva had looked at him across the perimeter with the specific quality of a physician who has identified a resource and is going to use it. And he had responded to that look with the equal directness of someone who had a contribution and was ready to make it. The compound, he said, looking at the diagnostic reading Threva was holding. You recognize it, Threva said, not a question. Chemically adjacent to a class of compounds I've worked with in human patients, he said. Different mechanism, similar pathway. The Sorvani antidote protocol. Do you have Velarat compound available in the hall's medical supply? Threva's expression moved with the specific quality of a physician, assessing a colleague's reasoning at speed. Not in the immediate supply. The palace pharmacy, 4 minutes. 4 minutes is manageable if we stabilize the cardiac response now, he said. The compound's primary action in the first phase is cardiovascular. If we address the phase 1 effect, the antidote has time to work. He indicated the specific intervention on the diagnostic readout. Does this read as available in the immediate kit? Threva looked at the reading, looked at him. Yes. Then we have time, he said. 4 minutes is enough. They worked with the specific collaborative quality of two physicians who had not worked together before and had no time for calibration. The combination of Threva's knowledge of the Queen's physiology and the Sorvani pharmacological tradition and Kale's cross-species medical training producing, in the compressed urgency of a medical crisis, the kind of exchange that years of professional collaboration sometimes failed to generate. He said things. She evaluated them at the speed her expertise allowed. She modified, confirmed, proceeded. He did the same with what she brought. The Phase 1 intervention was administered. The Velarat compound arrived at 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The antidote was administered. And then both of them stepped back from the Queen's position and entered the specific awful quality of medical waiting, the interval when everything that could be done had been done, and the outcome belonged to the patient's biology and not to the practitioner's skill. Kale went to the wall, not because he had been directed there, but because the correct thing, once his contribution was complete, was to clear the primary space for the healers whose patient this was and whose responsibility it remained. He sat against the wall with the quality of someone whose body had been running on a significant adrenaline response that was no longer necessary and had not yet finished processing its own cancellation. He looked at the hall. 200 people in formal attire, in a space that had been designed for the performance of diplomatic eating, were arranged in the specific configuration of people who had been through a shock and were now in the waiting that followed it. The noble houses at their positions, the military leadership, the diplomatic corps of several civilizations, all of them oriented toward the Queen's position and toward the diagnostic display that Threva was monitoring, and which was the only source of current information about what was happening. It was very quiet for a space that contained 200 people. At the 7-minute mark, the Queen's vital indicators improved. At 12 minutes, she was stable. At 20, she was conscious. The court's reorganization from emergency configuration to the configuration of formal aftermath had the specific quality of an institution returning to its own structure. The relief of the crisis resolved meeting the framework of the protocol that the resolution required. Cale observed this from his position against the wall, with the attentive awareness of someone who knew enough about Sorvani diplomatic culture to read what the reorganization was building toward. The noble class had a developed understanding of this situation. A foreign diplomat had saved the Queen's life. This was a significant act, and significant acts produced obligations, and Sorvani obligations had a well-established grammar. Wealth, the material acknowledgment of a service rendered, calibrated to the significance of the service. Title, the formal honorific that positioned the recipient correctly in the empire's hierarchical vocabulary, acknowledging the act without disturbing the hierarchy that assessed it. Public ceremony, the formal witnessing of the gratitude, conducted in the correct institutional register, conferring the acknowledgment with the weight of the court's assembled authority. This was what the room was arranging itself to receive. He could see it in the movement of the senior court figures, the specific positional shifts of people who knew where to stand for a formal presentation, the preparation of the ceremonial witnesses, the quiet, precise communications of a court that was organizing itself around an expected script. He was not thinking about the reward. He was thinking about the toxin, the specific compound, its origin, the question of how it had reached the ceremonial cup in a palace with the security architecture of the Sorvani imperial residence, which was a question that the court's intelligence apparatus was certainly addressing, and which was above his level of involvement and not his problem. He was thinking about the summit, the formal sessions that would resume tomorrow, the cooperative framework that the delegations had been building across the past week, the specific question of what this event would do to the temperature of those sessions. He was thinking about Threva and the specific quality of working with a physician of that caliber under those conditions, which had been, in its compressed and terrible urgency, genuinely remarkable. He was not thinking about himself particularly. The court finished its reorganization. The Queen was seated in the formal position, her composed authority returned, her long tapered ears at the angle of deliberate, present attention. The senior noble house representatives were in their ceremonial positions. The hall had the configuration of a formal presentation awaiting its opening. Cale straightened against the wall and prepared to be an appropriate witness to his own reward. The Queen stood. This was expected. The standing was the beginning of the formal address, the opening movement of the ceremonial acknowledgment that the court was arranged to receive. She looked at the assembled court. This was expected, the survey of the witness, the acknowledgment of the audience for what was about to be said, and then she stepped off the formal platform. This was not expected. Not in the Sorvani court's formal grammar, not in the specific script the room had been organizing around. The formal platform was where the acknowledgment happened, where the Queen stood when she was speaking as Queen, as the empire's authority, as the figure whose words in this space had the weight of the institution behind them. Stepping off it meant something. In the Sorvani court's ceremonial vocabulary, it meant something specific and significant, and the older members of the noble class registered it with the particular stillness of people whose understanding has just been updated. She crossed the hall, not with the formal processional of an official presentation, not with the ceremonial configuration that would accompany a title conferring or a material reward, with the specific directness of a person moving through a space to reach another person. Her long ears were at the angle he had come to associate, across the summit's formal sessions, with the Queen's genuine attention rather than her ceremonial attention, the personal register rather than the institutional one. She stopped in front of him. He was still against the wall, which was no longer the correct position, and he straightened fully, not from protocol exactly, but from the specific quality of the situation, which was that the queen of the Sorvani Empire was standing directly before him, and the wall was no longer appropriate context. She looked at him for a moment, he looked at her. "You moved before you knew," she said, quietly in standard, not for the court, for him. "I watched you move. You did not calculate, you simply moved." "I noticed something," he said. "I didn't have time to identify it specifically." "No," she said, "that is exactly it. You did not have time, and you moved anyway." Her expression carried something that was not the composed authority of the formal sessions and was not the ceremonial quality of an official presentation. It was the specific expression of one person looking at another person with complete honesty. "I am alive because you moved without time." "Threva," he began. "Threva did the work that saved me," she said. "She did it correctly and well, and I am grateful to her in ways the court understands how to witness." A pause. "What I am grateful to you for is different. It is not the medical knowledge. It is the specific thing that came before the medical knowledge, the thing that is not trained." She held his gaze. "I want to say that in front of my court, not as ceremony, as truth." She turned to the hall. The 200 members of the assembled Sorvani court, noble houses, military leadership, diplomatic corps, were in the specific stillness of people who are witnessing something they understand is significant and are determining what to make of it. The older members of the noble class, who had seen the queen step off the formal platform, had already updated their understanding. The others were in the process. "This man," the queen said, in Sorvani and then in standard, with the specific quality of someone choosing to be understood in both registers simultaneously, acted before he had a reason that could be named. He moved from the thing that is in a person before their reasons, the instinct that does not calculate benefit or position or consequence, but simply recognizes that a life is in danger and acts on that recognition. She paused. "This is not a thing I can reward with wealth or title. It is a thing I can only recognize. And I recognize it publicly in front of this court, because the court should know what its queen considers worth naming." The hall was very still. "Kael Riven is a friend of this empire," she said. "Not a title, a truth. A person who acted as a friend acts without calculation, from the simple logic of presence and recognition. I want this court to know that I understand the difference between those who serve the empire for what it offers and those who act from what they are." She looked at him directly. He acted from what he is. The stillness held for a moment that was longer than the previous ones. And then, beginning at the queen's immediate position, and moving outward through the hall with the specific gradual quality of a wave, moving through a medium that conducts it truly. The court responded, not with the formal ceremonial acknowledgment of an official reward, not with the managed applause of a scripted occasion, but with the specific response of 200 people who have witnessed something genuine and are responding to the genuineness of it. The Sorvani formal acknowledgment, the deep inclination of the head and the specific hand position of witness truth, moved through the hall from the most senior figures outward, and it carried the quality that distinguished it from the ceremonial version. It was unhurried, it was personal, and it was not uniform in the way of things that have been choreographed. Kael stood in the center of it with the specific quality of someone who has been named truly in a public space and is processing what it means to be seen accurately rather than ceremonially. The summit resumed the following morning with the institutional precision of a diplomatic process that had absorbed an extraordinary event and was continuing. The formal sessions had the specific quality of something that had been changed not in its structure, but in its temperature. The same agenda, the same delegations, the same careful negotiation of a cooperative framework, but with the warmth that came from an event that had made the relationship between the parties personal in a way that formal processes generally work to avoid. Kael attended the sessions in his attaché capacity, taking notes, monitoring the delegation's health logistics, performing the functions his role required. He was aware, in the peripheral attention that the sessions did not require, that the quality of his interactions with the Sorvani court figures had shifted. Not dramatically. The court's members were too experienced for dramatic shifts, but in the specific way of people who have had their categories revised and are operating with the revised version. He was no longer exclusively a foreign diplomat of limited formal standing. He was also the person the Queen had named publicly in a hall that had been very still while she named him. Ambassador Doran found him at the recess with the expression of someone who had a question she had been formulating since the previous evening. "The Queen stepped off the platform," she said. "Yes," he said, "in front of the entire court." "Yes." She looked at him with the assessment of someone who understood exactly what that meant in Sorvani ceremonial protocol and was processing the implications for the summit's outcomes. "The framework sessions this morning were different," she said. "The Sorvani delegation was, I don't have a more precise word for it than open, more open than yesterday." "Yes," he said, "I noticed that too." "The Queen said you acted from what you are," she said, "not from your role." "That's what she said." Doran was quiet for a moment. Then, with the specific honesty of a senior diplomat who was also a person, "She wasn't wrong." He looked at the summit corridor, the high vaulted passage of the imperial palace, ancient and deliberate, 4 centuries of significant events in its walls, and thought about a cup overturning in a banquet hall and the 4 seconds before it and the specific quality of instinct, which did not calculate. "I just noticed something," he said. "There wasn't time for anything else." "That's the part she named," Doran said. "That there wasn't time and you did it anyway." She looked at him with the quality of attention that experience and genuine regard produced in combination. "That's not nothing, Kale." "No," he said, "I understand that now." On the summit's final evening, the framework was signed in the correct ceremonial context, with the full weight of the Sorvani imperial protocol and the appropriate diplomatic formality of the Allied coalition. The document that would shape the cooperative relationship between the empire and its allied worlds for the next decades. Filed in both civilizations' official archives with the date and the signatures and the formal language of agreements made between powers. The reception that followed had the warm, released quality of a formal process completing well, the specific ease of people who have been working towards something and have arrived at it. Kale stood at the observation corridor's viewport, looking out at Varath Soma's capital below, the ancient city, lit in the evening cycle, the palace at its center with the 4 centuries of history in its stone. He held a glass he was not drinking from and thought about the week. He thought about the banquet hall and the 4 seconds and the overturning cup. He thought about Threva and the specific extraordinary quality of working with a physician of that caliber, in a crisis that neither of them had been prepared for. He thought about the Queen stepping off the formal platform and crossing the hall and standing in front of him with the honest, personal quality of someone who intended to say something true. He thought about what she had said. He acted from what he is. He had spent the day understanding what it meant to be named publicly and accurately, not for the act exactly, but for the thing in him that the act had come from. The thing that did not calculate. The thing that recognized a life in danger and moved before the reasons were assembled. He had not known before the previous evening that this was a thing worth naming. It had seemed simply the minimum, the thing any person would do if they noticed and had the capacity. He had noticed. He had had the capacity. He had moved. The Queen had looked at an entire court and said that this was what she considered worth naming. He was still days later in the process of understanding what that meant. Not the diplomatic implications. Those were visible and significant, and the summit's outcomes were better for the temperature the event had created. Not the professional implications, those were also visible. The changed quality of his standing with the Sorvani court, a fact that his role would carry forward. But the personal implication, the specific thing of having been seen accurately by someone whose seeing was thorough and whose public expression of it was genuine. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite large. The capital's lights continued below, patient and ancient and entirely indifferent to the agreements being made above them. The palace held its centuries in its stone. The framework they had signed would sit in archives for decades and would shape the relationship between civilizations in ways that the people who signed it would not live to see the full extent of. And in the record of the week, alongside the formal sessions and the cooperative framework and the diplomatic outcomes, there was a banquet hall and an overturned cup and a queen who had stepped off a platform to stand before a person and name a thing she considered worth naming. That was in the record too, in both civilizations' archives, as it should be.